Clara May Hutchins did not cry when Douglas Hart looked her up and down on that Laramie Station platform and said loud enough for half the town to hear, "That ain't the woman in the photograph. That's twice the woman. Send her back." She didn't cry when the crowd went quiet. She didn't cry when he dropped her letters in the dirt and walked away without once looking back. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped at her waist, and thought, "I have nowhere left to go." Then, a child's voice cut through the silence. "Papa, that lady's gonna fall." If this story moves you, please leave a like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's journey travels across this country. Subscribe to the channel and follow along to the very end, because this story is only just beginning. The platform at Laramie, Wyoming, smelled of coal smoke and dry summer heat, and Clara May Hutchins had been standing on it for less than 4 minutes when her entire future collapsed. She had known somewhere in the quiet, honest part of herself that this moment might come. 3 weeks on a train from Philadelphia gave a woman a great deal of time to think, and she had thought about it plenty. She had composed careful answers to the questions she feared most. She had rehearsed her smile. She had told herself that whatever Douglas Hart looked like, whatever he turned out to be, she would be gracious and steady and grateful, because gratitude was the appropriate response to being chosen. She had not prepared herself for the sound of a man's laughter. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone caught off guard by something deeply inconvenient. And it came out of Douglas Hart's throat the moment his eyes traveled from her face to the full, solid breadth of her shoulders, down the length of her, and back up again. He held her photograph in one hand and compared the two versions of her, the one in the image and the one standing before him in her best gray traveling dress, and he laughed. "That ain't right," he said to no one in particular. Then louder to the men standing behind him near the station wall. "Boys, I told you this business was a gamble." Clara did not move. Her carpet bag sat at her feet. Her hands, which she had trained to stay still through sheer will, stayed still. "Mr. Hart," she said quietly. "I'm Clara May Hutchins, from Philadelphia. We've corresponded for 8 months. I know who you are." He wasn't laughing anymore. He looked her over a second time, with the flat assessment of a man evaluating something he intended to return. "Question is whether you're who you said you were." "I am exactly who I said I was." "You said you were a healthy woman in good standing." He held up the photograph. "This here is a healthy woman. What's standing in front of me is something considerably more." One of the men near the wall snickered. Clara heard it. She felt the heat of it move across her face, but she kept her chin level. "The photograph was taken 4 months ago," she said. "I haven't changed." "Well, your photograph must have been sitting at an angle that was real flattering then. Because I'll tell you plainly, Miss Hutchins, this arrangement isn't going to work." He tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket with a finality that made her stomach drop. "I'll pay for your train back to Denver. That's a fair offer. More than fair, considering." "Considering what?" "Considering you misrepresented yourself." His voice had gone cool and businesslike, as though they were discussing a livestock trade that had gone sideways. "A man sends for a particular type of woman. He has a right to receive what he was promised." "I am what I promised. I can cook, I can keep house, I'm sure you're capable enough." He cut her off without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. "But capable isn't the only factor here. I have a business, I have a reputation in this town, and I have opinions about what's appropriate for my household." He picked up her carpet bag and held it out to her. "Train back to Denver leaves at 6. I'll wire ahead and cover the fare." Clara stood there for one long suspended moment. She looked at the bag in his outstretched hand. She looked at the small crowd that had drifted toward them on the platform, the way people in small towns drift toward anything that promises spectacle. She saw the women with their heads bent together already whispering. She saw a man near the station door, whose expression held something that might have been sympathy, and might have been relief that he wasn't Douglas Hart right now. She took the bag from his hand. She did not take the offer of train fare. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said. "I won't be needing the ticket." He blinked as though he hadn't expected that. Then he nodded, once adjusted his hat, and walked away. Just like that. 8 months of letters. 8 months of a man describing himself as lonely and hoping and ready to build something real. And he walked away in under 5 minutes without once looking back. The crowd on the platform shifted. A woman in a yellow dress murmured something to the woman beside her. An older man cleared his throat and looked away. The summer heat pressed down on everything and everyone. Clara stood where she was and breathed. Well, the woman in yellow spoke up loud enough to be heard. Her name, Clara would later learn, was Geraldine Potts, and she had opinions about everything. I suppose that's settled then. Poor man. He had such hopes. Poor man, Clara said very evenly, and looked at her. Yes. What a tragedy for him. Geraldine's eyes narrowed. I'm just saying arrangements like these require honesty. A woman in your situation has a responsibility to be clear about what a man is getting. A woman in my situation, Clara repeated. She let the words sit in the air between them for a moment. And what situation is that, ma'am? You know what I mean. I do. I just want to make sure everyone else does too. Clara looked around the platform slowly, calmly at all the watching faces. She means that a man has the right to return a woman like a bad piece of merchandise because he doesn't like the way she's built. That's the situation she's referring to. The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant people were paying very close attention. I didn't say that, Geraldine said sharply. No, but Mr. Hart did, more or less. Clara shifted her bag to her other hand. Now, if someone could direct me to a boarding house, I'd be grateful. An older man in a shopkeeper's apron stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He had kind eyes and the posture of someone who spent his days lifting heavy things. Miss Hutchins, I'm Henry Alderman. I run the general store here. I'm sorry about what happened. There's no boarding house in Laramie at present. We had a fire in the spring, and the new one isn't finished yet. I see. You have family back east. Anyone I could wire? No family. Funds for another train. Clara looked at him steadily. She did not look away, but she made herself say it. No, I used everything I had to make this trip. Mr. Hart's offer of return fare was I should have taken it, I know. But She stopped. She had been going to say that she didn't want to go back, that there was nothing to go back to, that she had made this journey because every road behind her had closed. She didn't say any of that. She just said, I didn't take it. Henry rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he looked around as if hoping someone nearby would offer a solution. Most of the crowd had the decency to look uncomfortable. Geraldine had drifted away. I'll ask around. Mrs. Chen at the restaurant sometimes takes in boarders, though I can't promise. She won't. A new voice from the far end of the platform. Everyone turned. The man who had spoken was standing where the platform steps met the street below. One boot on the lower step, his hat pushed back on his head. He was tall, somewhere around 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of working outdoors until it looked less like skin and more like territory. He had 3 children arranged around him, a girl of perhaps 14, standing rigid and straight at his left, a boy of about 9, slouching at his right, and a small girl of 5, who was currently pressed against his leg and staring at Clara with enormous gray eyes. Beg pardon, Henry said. Mrs. Chen won't take her in. The man came up the rest of the steps and crossed the platform without hurrying. Same as the hotel won't. Same as anywhere else in town. Because by supper tonight, every person in Laramie will know what happened here, and anybody who gives her a bed will be answering questions about it for the next 6 months. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Clara directly. Not the way Douglas Hart had looked at her, calculating, measuring, finding her wanting. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person. My name is Silas Whitfield. I run a cattle operation about 7 miles south. I've got more work than I can manage and 3 children who've been without a housekeeper since March. Clara waited. I'm offering you a job, he said. Room, board, fair wages, once I see what you can do. Work would be hard and the hours long. The house it needs attention. He glanced briefly at the older girl beside him, who was staring at Clara with an expression that could generously be described as unwelcoming. "My daughter Ruth Ann there will tell you it's a disaster. She won't be wrong." "It's not a disaster," the 14-year-old said tightly. "It's fine." Ruth Ann: "It is fine, Papa." "The boy's Benjamin," Silas continued without further argument. "He's 9. Doesn't say much, but he's capable. And the little one is Pearl." He looked down at the small girl pressed against his leg. "Pearl, say hello." Pearl didn't say hello. She continued staring at Clara with those wide gray eyes. Then she said very quietly, "Are you going to leave like all the others did?" The platform went absolutely still. Clara crouched down, which put her eye level with the child. Up close, she could see that Pearl's braids were unraveling, that her dress had been pressed badly, that there was a smear of something dried on her left sleeve. She could see the particular look of a child who had learned very early that people who appeared went away. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Clara said honestly. "So I suppose the answer is not today." Pearl considered this with the grave seriousness of a 5-year-old doing real philosophical work. Then she reached out and took hold of 2 fingers of Clara's right hand and did not let go. Silas Whitfield watched this happen. Something moved behind his eyes that Clara couldn't quite read. Not happiness exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it tangled up with pain. "Well," he said quietly, "that's settled then." He picked up Clara's carpetbag before she could object. "Wagons at the end of the street. We'll get you out before the heat gets worse." "Mr. Whitfield." Clara stood Pearl, still holding her fingers. "You should know that I didn't misrepresent myself to Douglas Hart. What you see is what was in those letters and what was in that photograph. I'm not going to apologize for it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Silas looked at her. "Didn't ask you to." "Some men would. Then they'd be wrong." He said it simply, the way a person states an obvious fact, and turned toward the station steps. Ruth Ann had not moved. She stood where she'd been standing, her arms folded across her chest, and she looked at Clara with the cold assessment of a girl who had designated herself the protector of something precious and was not prepared to stand down. "I can carry my own bag," she said. "And Benjamin can carry his. We don't need help." "Ruth Ann enough," Silas said. "I'm just saying what's true." "What you're doing," he said, and his voice was quiet, but had a floor to it, "is being rude to a woman who has had a very hard morning. That's not how I raised you." Ruth Ann's jaw tightened. She looked at Clara with the particular resentment of a teenager who knows she's lost an argument and hasn't accepted it yet. Then she turned and went down the platform steps without another word. Benjamin, who had been watching all of this with the detached interest of a boy who found people genuinely puzzling, looked up at Clara and said, "She's not always like that." "Well," he reconsidered, "she's kind of always like that. But she's usually got a reason." He picked up his own small bag from the platform boards and followed his sister. Clara stood for a moment, Pearl's hand still wrapped around her fingers, and breathed. "You all right?" Henry Alderman asked behind her. "I will be," she said. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Alderman." "I'm sorry I couldn't do more. You were decent to me when you didn't have to be. That counts for something." She went down the steps with Pearl beside her, and she did not look back at the platform where her future had been so publicly dismantled. She kept her eyes forward on the street ahead of her, on the broad back of Silas Whitfield, walking with her carpetbag like it weighed nothing on the rigid set of Ruth Ann's shoulders 20 feet ahead, on Benjamin scuffing his boot against the dust. She thought about the 8 months of letters in Douglas Hart's jacket pocket. She thought about the person she'd been when she wrote them, careful, hopeful, measuring every word. She thought about the morning she'd spent pressing her gray dress in the sleeping car with hands that had shaken with anticipation. She stopped thinking about it. There was no use in it now. The wagon ride south took the better part of an hour, and Clara learned more about the Whitfield family in that hour than she might have learned in a week of careful conversation, because Pearl talked without stopping from the moment they pulled out of town. Pearl told her that the black horse was named General, and he was old but reliable, and Papa said that was the best kind. Pearl told her that there were 11 chickens, and one of them was mean, and her name was Harriet, and you had to watch Harriet because Harriet would peck you if you didn't watch her. Pearl told her that Benjamin had broken his arm last winter falling out of the barn loft, and Papa had been very scared, even though he hadn't shown it. And Pearl knew he'd been scared because she had heard him praying in his room at night when he thought everyone was asleep. "Pearl," Silas said from the front of the wagon where he sat with the reins, "I'm just telling her things she needs to know, Papa." "You're telling her things that are my private business." "The praying part." Pearl considered this. "I think that's her business too, since she's coming to live with us." Benjamin, sitting across from Clara in the wagon bed, caught her eye and gave her a look that said quite clearly, "This happens all the time, and there is nothing to be done about it." Clara looked back at him and felt very unexpectedly the smallest pull of a smile. Ruth Ann sat at the far end of the wagon bed with her back straight and her eyes on the road behind them, as though she were keeping watch for something. She had not spoken since they left town. Clara did not push. She recognized that particular kind of silence, the silence of someone who had appointed themselves the last line of defense and was taking the responsibility very seriously. "How long has it been?" Clara asked quietly enough that it was between her and Silas at the front. "Since my wife passed?" He didn't look back. 2 years in April." "I'm sorry." Ruth Ann was 12 when it happened. She took it the hardest. He was quiet for a moment. "She keeps the house, tries to, and she's taken on more than any girl her age should have to. I know that. He stopped. Started again. "There's things I can't give them, no matter how hard I try." "What kind of things?" He was quiet long enough that Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "The kind that need a woman's hand, patience, teaching. The kind of care that doesn't look like work, but is." He shifted the reins from one hand to the other. "Pearl cried for a week when the last housekeeper left, said she missed having someone to brush her hair." Clara looked down at Pearl, who had fallen asleep against her arm, somewhere in the last mile her head, a warm and trusting weight. "Who brushes her hair now?" Clara asked. "Ruth Ann, when she'll hold still long enough." Something in his voice shifted. "Ruth Ann does her best. I don't want you to think she doesn't." "I don't think that," Clara said. "I think she loves her family, and she's scared of what it might mean if things change." Silas glanced back at her for the first time since they'd left town. It was a brief look, but she caught something in it, surprise maybe, or recognition. "Yeah," he said. "That's it exactly." The ranch came into view, and Clara looked at it with the practical eye of someone assessing a situation honestly. The house was solid 2 stories weathered, but standing built for permanence. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her where Silas Whitfield's priorities had been for the past 2 years. The garden to the east of the house was losing its fight with the weeds. The porch had a broken step. The shutters on the upper windows needed attention. It was not a disaster. Ruth Ann had been right about that. But it was a place that needed someone, and Clara May Hutchins, who had no one and nowhere, understood exactly what that felt like. Silas helped Pearl down from the wagon first, and the child immediately ran toward the barn, calling something about General getting a carrot. Benjamin dropped out of the back and disappeared in the direction of the house without ceremony. Ruth Ann climbed down on her own and turned to look at Clara, with her arms folded and her chin lifted. "There are rules," Ruth Ann said. "Ruth Ann," Silas began. "No, let her say them," Clara said. She looked at the girl steadily. "Go ahead." Ruth Ann blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Mama's room stays how it is." "All right. Her things don't get moved." "I understand." "And you don't tell us how things should be done because we've been doing things just fine." Her voice wobbled on the last words barely but enough. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said gently but directly, "The garden's about 2 weeks from dying. The porch step will give way under anyone heavier than Pearl. And you've been doing the work of a grown woman for 2 years when you should have been allowed to just be 14. She paused. "I'm not here to change anything about your mama or how you remember her. I'm here to work. That's all." Ruth Ann's jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Fine," she said. She turned and went inside. Silas stood beside Clara, and they both watched the door close behind his daughter. "She'll come around," he said. "She doesn't have to," Clara said. "I'm not here for her to like me. I'm here because we both need something, and this arrangement gives it to us." She looked at him. "What I told you on that platform, I meant it. I'll work hard, and I won't be a burden, and I won't ask for anything beyond what we agreed to. You won't regret taking a chance on me." Silas looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had lost faith in easy things and learned to look for the harder, truer kind. "Didn't figure I would," he said. He picked up her carpet bag again. "Come on, I'll show you the kitchen. You can tell me what you think needs doing and we'll go from there." He went inside. Clara stood on the porch for one moment alone, her hand resting on the wooden railing, looking out at the open Wyoming land spreading away from her in every direction. Behind her was a town that had watched her be discarded. Around her was a ranch that needed what she had to give. Inside was a man who had chosen basic decency when the easier choice was to walk past 3 children in 3 different stages of grief and need, and somewhere ahead was a life she hadn't planned for and couldn't yet imagine. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she went inside and got to work. The kitchen was, as she had suspected, a place where someone had been trying very hard with very little knowledge, and the evidence of that effort was in every pan and every shelf. Clara stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly and began quietly and methodically to understand what needed to happen first. She had tied on an apron she found on a peg near the door and was pulling flour from the pantry shelf when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Careful, deliberate footsteps, not Pearl's running gallop or Benjamin's indifferent stomp. She didn't turn around. "I know you think this is temporary," Ruth Ann said from the doorway, "and that you'll figure something else out and leave." "I might," Clara said, measuring flour with practiced hands. "I haven't made promises about forever, but I'm here now, and I'm going to cook supper, and tomorrow I'm going to look at that garden, and that's as far ahead as either of us needs to think right now." Silence. Then reluctantly footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. "The flour on the second shelf is weevily," Ruth Ann said. "Use the one on the bottom left." Clara looked at the shelf, moved her hand to the correct bin, and said, "Thank you." Neither of them said anything else for a while, but Ruth Ann didn't leave. She sat at the kitchen table and watched Clara work, and that Clara understood was the beginning of something. Not trust. Trust was months away if it came at all. But the beginning of watching, of considering, of a 14-year-old girl who had been standing guard over her broken family, deciding very provisionally that the woman in her kitchen might not be the enemy after all. Outside, Pearl was singing something tuneless and joyful near the barn. Benjamin came in through the back door, dropped a bucket of water by the pump without being asked, and left again without a word. Silas's boots crossed the floor above them as he moved through the upper rooms. Clara May Hutchins, who had arrived in Laramie that morning as someone's rejected cargo, stood at the stove of a house that wasn't hers and began making it into a home. She didn't know yet what this place would become. She didn't know about the hard weeks ahead, about Ruth Ann's resistance, and the moments that would break it, about the danger that would force her and Silas to stand side by side when everything they'd built was threatened, about the night she would prove to every doubting soul in Laramie exactly what she was made of. She didn't know what Pearl would whisper to her one quiet morning that would change the shape of everything. She knew the biscuits needed to go in before the fire cooled. She knew there was a broken step that needed a board before someone got hurt. She knew there was a child in the barn singing to a horse, and a boy who communicated in buckets of water, and a girl at her kitchen table who was watching her with eyes that hadn't decided yet. She knew she was still standing. For tonight, that was enough. Supper that first night was a quiet thing. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that sits at the table like a fifth person, nobody invited. Clara set out biscuits and salt pork and a pot of beans she'd stretched with dried herbs she found in the back of the pantry, and she put it all on the table without ceremony, and the 4 Whitfields sat down and looked at what was in front of them, the way people look at something they weren't expecting. Pearl picked up a biscuit, bit into it, and said, "Oh, just that." One small syllable of pure surprise. Benjamin reached for a second one before he'd finished the first. Silas said nothing for a long moment. He ate with the focused attention of someone who had spent 2 years treating food as fuel, and had forgotten it could be anything else. Then he set down his fork and said, "Miss Hutchins." "Clara," she said. He nodded once. "Clara, this is a real meal. It's just beans and biscuits. Last week we had beans that tasted like the pot they were cooked in, and biscuits that tasted like the pan." He looked at her across the table with those steady, weathered eyes. "Whatever you did different, I'd appreciate it if you kept doing it." "The biscuits need lard, not water," Clara said. "And the beans need time and a little patience, and someone who doesn't give up on them halfway through." Benjamin looked up at that. He had his father's eyes, and his father's way of saying things with his face that he didn't bother to say with his mouth, and what his face said right then was that he understood she might not only be talking about beans. Ruth Ann had eaten precisely half of what was on her plate methodically, and she set her fork down with the careful deliberateness of someone making a point without quite coming out and making it. "Mama made her biscuits with buttermilk," she said. "So did I," Clara said evenly. "Found a half-empty jug in the cold box." Ruth Ann looked at her. Something shifted in her expression the barest fraction. She kept it on the left side. I noticed. Pearl was already reaching for a third biscuit. Silas gently moved the plate closer to her. After supper, Silas told the children to clean up and took Clara out to the porch, where the evening air had finally begun to cool. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked out at the land the way a man looks at something he is responsible for and sometimes afraid of. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "I'd prefer it. This job, it's more than cooking and housekeeping. The children need Ruth Ann especially." He stopped, started again. "She's been running this household since her mother died. She was 12 years old, and she took it on because nobody else could, and I let her because I didn't know what else to do. That wasn't right of me. I know that." His jaw tightened. "She's 14 now, and she's angrier than she lets on, and some of that anger is at me, and some of it is going to land on you because you're here, and her mother isn't." "I know," Clara said. "You know. I was 14 once. I know what it looks like when a girl is holding everything together with both hands and pretending she doesn't need any help." She leaned against the porch railing. "I won't push her, but I won't pretend not to notice either. That wouldn't do her any favors." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Douglas Hart is an influential man in this town." Clara felt the name land in her chest, like a stone dropped in still water. "I'm aware. What he did today on that platform, people will have opinions about it, and about you, and about the fact that I brought you out here. Small towns talk." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that what people say doesn't change anything on my end. You were treated poorly, and I won't add to it. But I also won't lie to you and say there won't be difficulties. Mr. Whitfield." "Silas." "Silas." She looked at him steadily. "I walked off that platform with nothing and nowhere to go. Whatever difficulties come from me being here, they cannot possibly be worse than what I was already facing." She folded her hands. "I'm not afraid of Douglas Hart or this town's opinions. I'm afraid of failing your children because they're the ones who will pay for it if I do. That's the only thing I intend to worry about." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He pushed off from the post. "I'll leave you to settle in. Morning comes early." "I know how mornings work," she said, and there was just enough dry humor in it that his mouth moved slightly at the corner before he went inside. Clara stayed on the porch a while longer. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called long and lonesome, and the stars out here were nothing like the stars in Philadelphia, where the city swallowed most of them. Out here, they were extravagant, thrown across the sky without any restraint, and Clara stood under them and let herself feel small for just a moment, because sometimes feeling small was the only honest response to a very large day. Then she went inside and found Pearl sitting at the bottom of the stairs in her nightgown waiting. "I was supposed to be in bed," Pearl said without any particular guilt about not being in bed. "You were," Clara agreed. "I wanted to ask you something first. Pearl's gray eyes were serious in the lamplight. Do you know how to braid hair? Real braids, not the kind Papa does where they come loose by breakfast. Clara sat down on the step beside her. I do. Pearl exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for a considerable amount of time. Good, because Ruth Ann tries, but she pulls too hard, and Benjamin says braids are stupid, and Papa... She demonstrated her father's technique with her hands, a hopeless tangling gesture. Papa tries real hard. I'll braid your hair in the morning, Clara said. Right now, you need to sleep. Pearl nodded gravely and stood up. Then she stopped on the second step and turned back. Miss Hutchins. Clara. Clara. Pearl said the name carefully, trying it out. I'm glad you didn't take the train. Then she went upstairs, her small feet padding away into the dark. Clara sat on the step alone for a moment. She pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her sternum, where something had just shifted, and then she got up and went to her room. The room they'd given her was small and plain, with a window that looked toward the barn and a bed that was narrower than what she was used to, and it was entirely completely hers, in a way that no room had ever been hers before, and she understood only once she was in it how much that mattered. She slept like someone who had run a very long race and finally been allowed to stop. The rhythm of the ranch came to her faster than she expected, the way rhythms do when they match something you already carry inside you. She was up before dawn. Fire started coffee on the kitchen, warming itself against the early chill. And when Silas came in from the first round of barn work, there was food waiting. He said little. She said little. They moved around each other in the kitchen, with the careful courtesy of two people learning the geography of a shared space, and it was not uncomfortable. It was simply honest. Benjamin established his opinion of Clara in his own particular fashion, not through words which he treated as a limited resource to be spent wisely, but through small acts of pragmatic assistance. On the second morning, she found a full bucket of fresh water by the pump before she'd asked for it. On the third, he appeared without prompting to carry in firewood, while she was elbow-deep in bread dough. He never offered explanation or sought acknowledgement. He simply identified what was needed and provided it, and Clara respected that more than any amount of conversation. Your boy doesn't waste words, she said to Silas on the fourth morning. Silas almost smiled. His mother used to say he was born practical. Said he came out looking like he'd already figured out the important things and decided talking about them was redundant. She wasn't wrong. Something crossed his face, the particular expression that came when his wife was mentioned unexpectedly, a brief tightening around the eyes. No, she wasn't. Ruth Ann was the harder territory. Not hostile exactly. She was too controlled for open hostility, but watchful in the way of someone cataloging evidence. She appeared in the kitchen each morning and did her share without being asked, and she watched everything Clara did with those careful eyes, and she offered nothing except the occasional piece of practical information delivered in a tone of complete neutrality. The pump handle sticks if you don't lift it before you push. The chickens won't go in at night unless you scatter a little feed by the coop door. Papa likes his coffee stronger than most people can stand it. Each piece of information was useful. Each was delivered without warmth. Clara received them all the same way, a brief nod, a thank you. No attempt to make more of it than it was. She understood that Ruth Ann was testing something, working out whether Clara would try to push through her guard or would simply be patient enough to wait. Clara intended to be patient enough to wait. It was the garden that gave her the first real crack. She'd been working on it since the second morning before the heat of the day made outdoor work punishing. It was worse than she'd initially assessed. 3 seasons of inconsistent attention had compacted the soil into something approaching clay, and the weeds had established themselves like squatters who'd been there long enough to consider themselves residents. But underneath the neglect, she could feel the shape of what it had been. Whoever had planted this garden had known exactly what they were doing. She was on her knees working out a particularly stubborn thistle root when Ruth Ann appeared beside her and crouched down without any preamble. Mama planted the tomatoes along the south row because of the afternoon sun, Ruth Ann said. Her voice was different out here than in the kitchen, less controlled. She said every plant has a reason it grows where it grows, and you have to figure out the reason before you start moving things around. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the south row. She was right. See how the ones at the far end are thinner? The barn shadow catches them in late afternoon. She probably knew that and planted her hardier varieties there. Ruth Ann looked at the far end of the row. The yellow ones, she said. She always said those were the stubborn ones. Said she liked them best because they didn't give up. A pause opened between them. Not an uncomfortable one. She sounds like she knew her garden, Clara said. She knew everything. Ruth Ann's voice was very quiet. She knew which plants needed more water and which ones needed less, and she could tell by looking at a leaf what was wrong. I tried to keep it up after I tried. But I didn't know enough and nobody could tell me, and by last summer it was already... She stopped. Her jaw worked. You kept the tomatoes alive, Clara said. That's not nothing. Those are stubborn plants, and they're still here. Ruth Ann looked at the row for a long moment. Then she said, The soil's compacted along the middle section. You need to break it up before you water, or the water just runs off. I was going to try the fork from the barn. There's a hand cultivator hanging inside the barn door left side. Mama had it made special. Smaller handle. Ruth Ann stood up. It fits better for working close in. She went back to the house. She didn't offer to stay and help, but she'd given Clara her mother's tool, and they both understood what that meant, even if neither of them said so out loud. Pearl, for her part, had decided that the question of whether Clara was a permanent feature of her world was settled and required no further deliberation. She appeared at Clara's side at every available opportunity, offering a running commentary on all subjects of importance. The temperament of individual chickens, the relative merits of different horses, the specific injustice of bedtime being earlier for 5-year-olds than for 9-year-olds. Clara listened to all of it with genuine attention, which Pearl recognized and rewarded with the particular devotion of a child who has found an adult who actually hears them. On the 5th evening, Pearl climbed into the chair beside Clara while she was mending a tear in Benjamin's shirt and leaned against her arm with the full, unself-conscious weight of a child who has decided a person is safe. Clara, she said. Are you going to be our housekeeper forever or just for a while? Clara set down the shirt. I don't know yet, sweetheart. That's an honest answer. Pearl considered this. What would make it forever? Pearl, Silas said from across the room where he'd been going over his ledger, that's not a question you ask. Why not? Because it puts people in an uncomfortable position. She doesn't look uncomfortable. Pearl assessed Clara with clinical precision. Do you feel uncomfortable? A little, Clara admitted. But only because it's a big question and I don't have a big answer yet. Pearl accepted this with a nod of philosophical generosity. That's okay. I'll wait. She picked up the shirt and held the unmended end toward Clara helpfully. Silas was not looking at his ledger anymore. He was watching his youngest daughter with an expression that Clara was beginning to recognize love so large it didn't quite fit inside his face, pressing against the edges of his composure. He caught Clara's eye across the room, and the look between them was brief and unguarded, and held something neither of them was ready to name yet. He looked back at his ledger. Clara looked back at the shirt. The trouble came on the 8th day, the way trouble in small towns always comes through someone else's mouth before it reaches you directly. Henry Alderman appeared at the ranch in his buckboard just after noon, his face carrying the expression of a man bearing news he'd rather not carry. Silas met him in the yard. Clara, coming out of the house with Pearl on her heels, stopped on the porch when she heard Douglas Hart's name. He's been talking. Henry set his hat in his hands. In the saloon, at the feed store, wherever he can find ears. Saying the situation out here isn't appropriate. Saying a woman of he uses the word disreputable. Silas, and I want you to know I told him to his face. That was a foul thing to say. What is he specifically saying? Silas asked. His voice was quiet. Clara had learned that Silas Whitfield's voice went quieter as he became angrier, not louder. He's saying she misrepresented herself to him deliberately, and that a woman who would do that isn't a fit influence for children. He's suggesting... Henry stopped. He's suggesting folks might want to consider whether the county ought to be involved, given that she's an unmarried woman living in a household with a widower. The porch went very still. Clara felt Pearl's hand find hers. "He can suggest all he likes," Silas said. "I know. I'm just telling you so you're not surprised if someone comes out here. Geraldine Potts has already written a letter to the county office. Maybe nothing will come of it. Probably nothing will come of it. But I thought you should know." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate you making the ride to tell me, Henry. There are folks in town who don't agree with Douglas," Henry said. "My Catherine for one, the Reverend Marsh for another. You've got people in your corner. I wanted you to know what you're up against." After Henry left, Silas stood in the yard for a moment. Clara came down the porch steps, Pearl still holding her hand. "I should go," Clara said. Silas turned to look at her. "If my being here is going to bring this kind of trouble down on your family, you're not going anywhere," he said. It came out flat and final the way he said things when they were not under discussion. "What Hart is doing is harassment of a woman who refused to be humiliated quietly, and I won't reward that by sending you away. That's not how things work on this ranch. Silas, your children, my children need what you've given them this past week more than they need the good opinion of Douglas Hart." Something fierce moved behind his eyes. Ruth Ann smiled yesterday. Did you know that first time I've seen her smile since in a long time? And Pearl slept through the whole night without coming to find me because she was scared. He looked at her steadily. "You're staying." Clara looked at him. She looked at Pearl, who was watching both of them with wide, serious eyes and an expression that suggested she was following every word. She looked back at Silas. "All right," she said. "All right." He picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it. "I'm going to ride to town tomorrow morning and have a conversation with Douglas Hart." "Don't do anything that gives him more ammunition." The corner of his mouth moved. "I intend to have a very calm, very legal, very public conversation with him in front of as many witnesses as I can arrange." He settled his hat on his head. "I have some opinions about men who use the county as a weapon against women they've decided to punish. I intend to share them." He went toward the barn. Clara stood in the yard and breathed and felt something she had not expected to feel, the particular unfamiliar warmth of being defended. Not rescued. Defended. By someone who had looked at the situation clearly and decided that standing with her was simply the right thing to do. "Miss Clara," Pearl said. Is Douglas Hart the bad man?" Clara considered this for a moment. "He's a man who made a small, mean choice and is now trying to make everyone around him pay for his own embarrassment. That's not the same as being a bad man, but it's not far off." Pearl seemed to find this a satisfying answer. She tugged on Clara's hand. "Come on. Harriet got out of the coop again, and she's in the vegetable garden, and she needs to be caught before she gets the bean seedlings." Clara let herself be led toward the crisis at hand, because on a working ranch, there was always a crisis at hand, and the trick she was learning was to meet each one as it came and not spend too much energy on the ones still approaching. The beans needed saving. Pearl needed help. Harriet needed catching. Everything else could wait its turn. Silas rode to town the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, and he came back 4 hours later with a quietness around him that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was the silence of a man who was thinking. This was the silence of a man who had done something and was sitting with the weight of it. Clara was in the garden when he came back. She watched him unsaddle General and lead him to the water trough, and she watched the set of his shoulders, and she waited until he came toward the house before she said anything. "How did it go?" He stopped. "Hart won't be filing anything with the county." "What did you say to him?" "I reminded him that he has a legally binding contract with my ranch for feed and grain delivery through the end of the year. And I told him very calmly that if any county official showed up at my property, making inquiries based on his personal grievances, I would consider that contract null and void, and I would make sure every rancher within 30 miles knew exactly why." He paused. Then I told him that slander is a legal matter, and that I had already spoken to the Reverend Marsh, who had agreed to write a letter on your behalf to anyone who needed one written. Clara was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do all of that. I know. He looked at her directly. I wanted to. She looked back at the garden because it was easier than looking at him when he said things like that. Thank you, Silas. He went inside. Clara went back to the tomatoes, but her hands were not quite steady for the next few minutes, and she let them be unsteady, because there was no one watching except the stubborn yellow tomatoes, and she figured they'd seen worse. The week that followed was the closest thing to ordinary that Clara had known in longer than she could easily remember. The days had a shape to them now, a beginning and a middle and an end, punctuated by small events that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. Benjamin figured out that Clara would answer questions honestly if you asked them plainly, and he began asking them about Philadelphia, about trains, about whether she thought a man could make a living raising horses instead of cattle, about whether she'd ever seen the ocean. She answered all of them with the same directness he used to ask, and she watched him filing the answers away, somewhere behind those careful eyes. Pearl had appointed herself Clara's assistant in all domestic matters and took the role with profound seriousness. She carried things that were too heavy for her without complaint. She reported on the status of the chickens each morning, with the gravity of a general giving a battlefield assessment. She had also, with no particular announcement, begun calling Clara by name instead of Miss Hutchins, and the shift was so natural that Clara didn't notice it had happened until Pearl had been doing it for 3 days. Ruth Ann was the one who caught her off guard. It was a Wednesday evening, 10 days after Clara's arrival, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the household accounts that Silas had left her, trying to understand why the flour was running out faster than it should, when Ruth Ann came and sat across from her, without being asked. "You're looking at the feed bill wrong," Ruth Ann said. Clara looked up. "Papa combines the chicken feed and the garden supply costs in the same column. Has done since Mama died because he doesn't know how to separate them. So it looks like you're spending more on flour than you are." Ruth Ann reached across and pointed to a line halfway down the page. "That right there is 50 pounds of laying mash, not flour." Clara looked at the line. She looked at Ruth Ann. "How long have you been managing these accounts?" "Since March." Ruth Ann sat back. "Papa does the cattle numbers. I do the household ones. He doesn't always check mine." "Why not?" "Because he trusts me." She said it without pride, just as a fact. Then quietly, "And because I think it's easier for him not to look too closely at the household things. Because Mama used to do them." Clara set down the pencil. "That's a lot to carry." "It's fine." "Ruth Ann." "It is fine," the girl said, but her voice had lost its armor just slightly, the way it did sometimes when she was tired and forgot to keep it up. I want to make sure it's done right. I want to make sure he doesn't have to worry about it on top of everything else." "He shouldn't have to worry about it at all," Clara said gently. "And neither should you. That's supposed to be my job now." Ruth Ann looked at the table. "You might leave." "I might. The last housekeeper didn't even say goodbye. She just wasn't here one morning." Ruth Ann's jaw was tight. "Pearl cried for 4 days." "I know," Clara said. "Pearl told me." "So you understand why." Ruth Ann stopped, started again. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I know that too." Clara folded her hands on top of the account book. "You're trying to protect them. Your brother and your sister and your father. You've been doing it for 2 years and you're very good at it." She paused. "But Ruth Ann, you are 14 years old. You are allowed to not be good at it sometimes. You are allowed to let someone else carry some of it." The kitchen was very quiet. "What if you leave anyway?" Ruth Ann asked. It came out smaller than she'd intended, and Clara could see in her face the moment she realized she'd said the true thing instead of the safe thing, and the flash of vulnerability that followed. "Then I'll say goodbye first," Clara said. "I promise you that much. Whatever happens, I will say goodbye." Ruth Ann nodded. Once brief, controlled. Then she stood up and picked up the account book and said, "I'll separate the columns tonight and leave it for you in the morning. It'll make more sense." "Thank you." Ruth Ann was almost to the door when she stopped. She didn't turn around. "The tomatoes in the south row," she said. "Mama always pinched the suckers out in the third week of growth. She said it made the fruit come in stronger." She paused. "They're probably at that stage now. I'll do it tomorrow morning," Clara said. Ruth Ann went upstairs. Clara sat at the table alone for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, which was not a dramatic thing, not something anyone watching from outside would have identified as significant, but which was in the way of all real things, enormous. The crisis, when it came on a Thursday afternoon with no warning at all, because that was the nature of crises on working ranches. They did not send word ahead. Clara heard the commotion from inside the house, a shout from the direction of the barn in Benjamin's voice, which alarmed her immediately because Benjamin did not shout. She was out the back door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Benjamin was standing outside the barn, his face white under his summer color, and he was shouting for his father. Silas came from the far pasture at a run, and Clara reached the barn at the same time he did. The situation inside was immediately clear and immediately bad. One of the mares, a gray named Sadie that Benjamin had been working with, had gone down in her stall. She was on her side, her breathing fast, and labored, her legs moving in the irregular, frightened way of an animal in serious pain. The smell hit Clara before anything else, and she recognized it because her uncle in Pennsylvania had kept horses, and she had seen this before. "She's colicking," Clara said. Silas was already in the stall, crouching beside the mare's head, his hands moving over her, assessing. "How bad?" "Her gut sounds," Clara said, moving to the stall door. She listened. Then, "Silas, get her up. She cannot stay down." "I know. Do you need help?" He looked up at her. "You know horses." "Enough. My uncle raised them. Tell me what you need." "Get her head. Talk to her. Keep her focused on you while I get her hindquarters up." Clara went into the stall without hesitating, which was not a small thing, because a horse in colic pain was an unpredictable animal, and Silas's eyes registered that she understood that, and came in anyway. She got her hands on Sadie's head, on the warm skin below her ear, and she began talking in a low, steady voice. Not the words, so much as the tone, the unbroken thread of calm sound that told the animal that the person touching her was not afraid. "Hey girl, hey Sadie, I've got you. You stay with me. Come on now, stay with me." Silas got Sadie's hindquarters up first, then her forequarters, and then they had her on her feet, and the mare was trembling and leaning. And Clara held her head and kept talking, while Silas moved quickly, efficiently, the hands of a man who knew livestock in the way you only know something you've spent your life with. Benjamin appeared in the stall doorway. His face was still pale. "Is she going to die?" "Not if I can help it," Silas said. "Ben, I need you to go to the tack room and get the oil from the second shelf. Brown bottle. Go." Benjamin went. Pearl appeared where Benjamin had been standing, her eyes very wide, and Clara looked at her over Sadie's neck and said, "Pearl, I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me the bucket by the pump and fill it halfway. Can you do that?" "Is Sadie going to be okay?" "We're working on it. Bucket, please." Pearl ran. Ruth Ann came last, drawn by the commotion, and she stopped in the barn doorway and took in the scene, and without a word went to the near wall and took down a lead rope and brought it to her father, because she had grown up on this ranch, and she knew what was needed. "Good girl," Silas said, not looking up. Ruth Ann stayed by the wall, not in the way just present, and her eyes moved between her father and Clara with an expression Clara didn't have time to read. The next 2 hours were the kind that collapsed time, the kind where you stopped thinking and only moved where your hands did what they knew, and your mind stayed only on the immediate thing in front of you. Silas and Clara worked the mare, walking her, monitoring, watching for the signs that would tell them whether this was going to turn or whether it was going to get worse. Benjamin brought what was needed and asked no questions. Pearl sat on a hay bale outside the stall and watched with enormous eyes and did not cry, though her lip trembled more than once. It was Ruth Ann who made the coffee. Clara didn't know when she'd slipped away, but around the second hour, Ruth Ann appeared with 2 cups and set one on the stall rail for her father and held the other out to Clara without a word. Clara took it. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, and Ruth Ann didn't pull back immediately. "Is this what you did?" Ruth Ann asked. Her voice was very quiet. "Before, in Pennsylvania." "Some of it." "You're not scared of her." "I'm a little scared of her," Clara said honestly. "She's a 1,200-pound animal in pain, but being scared doesn't mean you stop." She looked at the girl. "That's something your father does too, in case you hadn't noticed." Ruth Ann looked at her father, who was on the far side of the mare, his attention entirely on the animal, his hand steady. "I noticed," she said. The mare turned the corner close to sundown. It happened the way these things happened when they went right gradually, and then all at once, the breathing easing, the pain receding. Sadie finally drinking on her own from the bucket Pearl had refilled 3 times without being asked. Silas stood back and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. He put his hands on the top rail of the stall and dropped his head for a moment. "She'll do," he said. Benjamin said, "Yeah," in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite managing it. Pearl launched herself off the hay bale and wrapped both arms around Clara's waist from behind. Her face pressed into Clara's back, and she held on without saying anything. Clara put one hand over Pearl's clasped hands and held them there. She felt Ruth Ann watching. She turned slowly and found the girl standing a few feet away, with the expression of someone who has been keeping a careful accounting in their head and has just recalculated the total and found it different from what they expected. "You could have stayed in the house," Ruth Ann said. "It wasn't your horse." "She needed help," Clara said simply. "You could have gotten hurt." "I know." Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mama would have done the same thing." She said it like she hadn't planned to say it, like it had arrived on its own without her permission. Her eyes went a little bright, and she pressed her lips together hard and looked away. "I didn't know your mama," Clara said quietly, "but from what I can tell, she was someone who didn't walk away from things that needed doing, and she raised children who don't either." She looked at Benjamin, who was brushing Sadie's neck with methodical care, and at Pearl, who had not let go of Clara's waist, and back at Ruth Ann. "You should be proud of yourself, all 3 of you." Ruth Ann nodded, short, tight, controlled, but her eyes were still bright. It was Silas who finally broke the moment, because the work still needed finishing, and the horses still needed feeding, and supper had not made itself while they'd been in the barn. He distributed tasks with quiet efficiency, and the family moved to accomplish them, and Clara went back to the house to figure out what could be made quickly from what was left in the kitchen, and she was elbow deep in whatever that was going to be when she heard Silas come in behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard him stop in the middle of the kitchen. "Clara, supper will be about 40 minutes, she said. "I'm doing what I can with what's left in the—" "Clara." His voice had a different quality than usual. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor, his hat in his hands, his face carrying the full weight of the afternoon. "Thank you for what you did out there. It needed doing. You could have been hurt." That's what Ruth Ann said. Ruth Ann's right. He took a step closer, and something in the space between them changed the way air changes before weather, that almost imperceptible shift in pressure. "I need you to understand something. This ranch, these children, what's been built here in the past 2 weeks, what you've brought back into this house." He stopped. His hands tightened on the hat brim. "I don't want to lose that." Clara looked at him. "Silas." "I'm not saying anything that needs a response right now," he said. He seemed to decide something. "I'm just saying that you matter here. Whatever you came here thinking this was, whatever arrangement we made standing on that platform, I want you to know that you matter here. To this family." He paused. "To me." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked and settled in the stove. Clara turned back to the pot on the stove because she needed a moment that he was decent enough to give her. She stirred what was in the pot. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. 40 minutes, she said. "Go wash up. Bring the children." She heard him stand there for another moment. Then she heard him move toward the door. Then she heard him stop. "The county office sent a letter back to Hart today," he said. "Henry brought it out when I was in the far pasture. That's why I didn't mention it earlier. The letter said There were no grounds for any inquiry and suggested that Mr. Hart concern himself with his own affairs. A pause. Thought you should know. Clara stared at the pot. I see. Douglas Hart has had the last word on the subject of Clara May Hutchins, Silas said. I intend to make sure of that. He went to wash up. Clara stood at the stove and breathed slowly and thought about the woman who had stood on a platform 11 days ago with nowhere to go and nothing left and a torn future at her feet. She thought about how that woman had walked off that platform with a 5-year-old's fingers wrapped around her hand, and she thought about the 14-year-old who had just compared her to her mother, and she thought about the man who had just stood in her kitchen and said she mattered. She stirred the pot. She adjusted the heat. She sliced bread. By the time 4 sets of footsteps came down the stairs and across the floor toward the kitchen table, the meal was ready, and Clara was herself again. Or rather, she was more herself than she'd been in years, and the difference between those two things was what she was only just beginning to understand. The letter from the county office should have ended it. In a just world, it would have. Douglas Hart would have read, the county's response felt the particular sting of a small man being told publicly that his grievance held no water, and retreated to the quiet management of his embarrassment. That was what should have happened. What actually happened was that Douglas Hart decided that if the county wouldn't act, the town would have to do his work for him instead. Clara learned about it the way she'd learned about most things in Laramie through Henry Alderman, who appeared on a Saturday morning with his wife Catherine beside him in the buckboard, and whose face carried the careful expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was hoping it would land gently. It did not land gently. He's been to see Reverend Marsh, Henry said. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and Silas was standing across from him. And Clara had come out from the kitchen, because Pearl had seen the buckboard from the window, and announced it with enough excitement that Clara had dried her hands and followed. He told the Reverend that the situation out here is an affront to community standards, that a decent man's children are being raised under a roof with a woman of questionable character. Silas said nothing. His jaw was very tight. The Reverend didn't agree with him, Catherine said quickly. She was a solid woman in her 50s, with gray-threaded hair and the direct manner of someone who had lived long enough to dispense with softening things unnecessarily. She looked at Clara as she said it. I want to be clear about that. Reverend Marsh told Douglas Hart that Christian charity extended to women in difficult circumstances and that he would not be weaponizing his pulpit on behalf of wounded pride. Those were his exact words. But, Clara said. Catherine sighed. But there's a town meeting called for Tuesday evening. Hart has framed it as a community welfare discussion. People will come because people always come to things like that, and some of them will come already having decided, and some of them will come with open minds, and what they decide will affect this family, Clara said. It could affect your situation here, yes. Clara looked at Silas. He was still looking at Henry, and the quietness around him had reached the level that she now knew meant he was controlling something considerable. Silas, she said. He looked at her. I should go, she said. Before Tuesday. I should go before this becomes something that damages your standing here, your children's standing. No. The word came out flat and immediate, the same way it had when she'd said it the first time, and it had the same quality of being entirely non-negotiable. If I leave, he gets what he wants, Clara said. But your family is protected, and if you leave, he learns that he can drive any woman he decides to target out of this county by organizing a town meeting against her. Silas looked at her with complete steadiness. And I will not teach my children that lesson. Not in my house. Not ever. Henry cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Clara, Catherine, and I will be at that meeting. The Johnsons have already said they'll come. You have people. You have more people than you know, Catherine said. She was still looking at Clara, and there was something in her expression that was not pity, but was in the neighborhood of fierce solidarity. Half the women in this town have had Douglas Hart treat them like inconveniences at one point or another. He runs his store like he's doing people a favor by selling to them, and he talks over women like they're furniture, and some of us have been waiting a good long while for someone to stop smiling and take it. She paused. You stopped smiling and took it on a very public platform, and you did it with your head up, and that counted for something. Clara did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Tuesday, Silas said to Henry. What time? 7 in the evening, at the church hall. We'll be there. Henry blinked. We, Clara and I. Silas's voice did not invite discussion. If Hart wants to have this conversation publicly, then we'll have it publicly. Clara will speak for herself. I'll speak for my household. And anybody in that room who has something to say is welcome to say it to our faces instead of in whispers. After Henry and Catherine left, Silas and Clara stood in the yard together for a moment in the particular silence that follows news that has just changed the shape of your week. You don't have to come with me, Clara said. I know. It could make things worse. Some people will see it as, Clara. He turned to look at her, and his eyes had that quality she'd noticed the night of the mare's colic, the look of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating. I have spent 2 years putting my head down and working and not making trouble, and trying to give my children a quiet life. And I have 3 children who have been sad and unsteady, and going without things they needed because I was too busy keeping the peace to fight for what was right in front of me. He stopped. I'm done keeping the peace with people who don't deserve it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, because looking at him directly when he said things like that required more composure than she currently had. All right, she said. Tuesday then. What she had not accounted for was Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann came to find her that afternoon appearing in the doorway of the room where Clara was mending with the expression of someone who has been thinking hard about something and has arrived at a conclusion that cost them something to reach. I want to come, she said, to the town meeting. Ruth Ann, I'm 14, I'm not a child. She came in and sat on the edge of the chair across from Clara, straight-backed, composed every inch the girl who had been holding her family together for 2 years. And I want to come because... She stopped, tried again. Because you went into that stall with Sadie, and you didn't have to. And because you fixed the garden, and you teach Pearl her letters, and you didn't once try to move any of Mama's things without asking. And because Douglas Hart is saying things about you that aren't true, and I want to be in the room when people hear they aren't true. Clara set down the mending. Your father will be there. I know, I want to be there too. Ruth Ann's chin was up. She was our housekeeper. People should see that we're standing by her. I'm still your housekeeper, Clara said. Ruth Ann looked at her. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. You know what I mean. Clara did know what she meant. She thought about it for a moment, and then she said, Ask your father. Silas said yes. Benjamin immediately announced that if Ruth Ann was going, he was going. Pearl announced that if everyone was going, she was also going. Silas looked at Clara over Pearl's head with the expression of a man whose plan had expanded considerably beyond its original scope. The whole family, then, he said. Apparently, Clara said. Tuesday evening came with the slow, heavy deliberateness of things that have been dreaded. Clara dressed carefully, not in her best dress, which would have looked like she was trying to impress, but in her good plain dress, pressed and neat, the dress of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and was simply being exactly what she was. She did her hair with the same plain efficiency. She looked at herself in the small mirror and thought, this is what Douglas Hart rejected, and this is what Silas Whitfield drove to town to defend, and those two facts together tell you everything you need to know about the difference between those two men. The church hall was full when they arrived, which Clara had expected, and the faces that turned toward them when they walked in together were a range of things: curiosity, sympathy, judgment, and in some cases the carefully neutral expression of people who hadn't decided yet and were waiting to see which way the wind blew. Douglas Hart was seated near the front with Geraldine Potts and 2 men Clara didn't recognize. He looked up when they came in, and something moved across his face that might have been surprise at seeing all 5 of them, or might have been the first intimation that this evening was not going to go the way he'd planned. Henry and Catherine Alderman were in the 3rd row, and Henry nodded when he saw them. The Reverend Marsh was standing near the front, and he made his way towards Silas and Clara with the expression of a man who intends to make his position visible. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, shaking Silas's hand. Then he turned to Clara and shook hers as well, firmly in full view of the room. "Miss Hutchins, I'm glad you came." "Thank you for what you said to Mr. Hart," Clara said. "I said what was true." He looked at her steadily. "I intend to keep saying it." They found seats. Pearl was pressed against Clara's left side, her hand wrapped around Clara's arm. Benjamin sat on the aisle with his arms folded, studying the room with his usual analytical calm. Ruth Ann sat on Clara's right, and she did not fold her arms or study the room. She sat straight and looked forward, and her jaw was set, and she looked, Clara thought, very much like her father. The meeting opened with formalities that nobody was paying attention to because everyone in the room knew why they were there. It was Douglas Hart who moved it to its actual purpose, standing up with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to speaking in public and comfortable with the sound of his own voice. "The matter before this community," he began, "is a simple one of standards. Of what kind of household we consider appropriate for the raising of children in this county. Of what kind of woman we consider a suitable influence. What kind of woman," Clara said clearly and without standing up, "is the kind who arrived on a train after 8 months of honest correspondence and was rejected in front of a crowd because the man who sent for her decided he didn't like what she looked like." The room went very still. Douglas Hart turned to look at her. His face had gone red. "This is not the appropriate time." "You called a town meeting about me," Clara said. Her voice was even. Her hands in her lap were folded and still. "I think this is exactly the appropriate time." She stood then, because if she was going to speak, she was going to be seen. "My name is Clara May Hutchins. I came to Laramie 6 weeks ago to marry a man who had spent 8 months telling me in letters that he wanted a partner and a companion and someone to build a life with. When I stepped off that train, he looked at me and said I was too big. He said I didn't match what he'd ordered." She paused and let that sit in the room. "He said those words out loud in public within earshot of a crowd, and then he walked away and left me stranded with no money and nowhere to go." She looked around the room slowly, at the women especially. "I am not a woman of questionable character," she said. "I am a woman who was humiliated in public by a man who confused a mail-order arrangement with a purchase he could return and who is now trying to use this community as a tool to punish me for not accepting that humiliation quietly." She looked at Hart directly. "I worked for 8 months to build something with that man through those letters. I traveled 3 weeks across this country on faith, and I have spent the last 6 weeks earning my place in the Whitfield household through honest work every single day." She sat back down. The room was completely silent. Then Catherine Alderman stood up. "I have known Silas Whitfield for 11 years, she said. She didn't look at Hart. She looked at the room. "I knew his wife. I know his children. And I want this community to understand that what I have seen in the past 6 weeks is a man's household come back to life. I have seen those children fed and taught and cared for in ways they haven't been in 2 years. And I have seen a woman do that work with more dignity than most of us could manage after being treated the way she was treated on that platform." She paused. "Douglas Hart is not concerned about community standards. Douglas Hart is concerned about his pride." 2 other women stood before Catherine had fully sat down. Then the Reverend Marsh spoke, and what he said was brief and direct and carried the particular weight of a man whose opinion in a room like this meant something. And Hart, who had understood the room as a tool and was now discovering that tools have 2 edges, sat very still with a fixed expression that Clara recognized as the face of a man doing rapid calculations. Silas spoke last, and he stood, and he said simply, "Clara Hutchins is a woman of good character doing honest work in my household. She has my full confidence and my family's support. That is all I have to say on the matter." He sat back down. Pearl immediately took hold of his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers, without looking down, and Clara watched this, and felt something press hard against the inside of her ribs. The meeting did not end in any dramatic resolution. These things rarely did. People filed out and spoke in small groups, and the Reverend talked quietly with the aldermans, and Hart left early with Geraldine Potts and his 2 associates, and his leaving felt less like defeat and more like a strategic retreat, which Clara understood was not the same thing. He was not finished. Men like that were rarely finished. But the room had spoken, and it had not spoken in his favor, and that mattered. On the ride home, the wagon moved through the dark with General's steady pace and the stars overhead, and the children quiet in the back, worn out by the evening's gravity, in the way that children became worn out by adult things. They understood only partially, but felt completely. Pearl fell asleep against Benjamin's shoulder. Benjamin did not move away. Ruth Ann sat looking out at the passing dark and said finally quietly, "People listened." "Some of them," Clara said. "Enough of them." Ruth Ann turned to look at her. In the dark, it was harder to read her face, but Clara could hear something in her voice that she hadn't heard there before, something that was not cautious, not measured, not held at arm's length. "You didn't look scared. Up there, standing and talking like that." "I was scared," Clara said. "You didn't look it." "That's something your father does too," Clara said. "In case you hadn't noticed." In the front, she heard Silas make a small sound that might have been a laugh. Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't take the train back to Denver." Clara looked at her. The girl was looking back out at the dark again, her profile composed, giving away very little, but the words were there, and they had been said, and they could not be unsaid. "So am I," Clara said. The ranch was dark and quiet when they pulled in, and the children went inside ahead of them. Pearl carried in Silas's arms, still half asleep, Benjamin holding the lamp. Ruth Ann going ahead to put the kettle on without being asked, because she knew that after something large, people needed something small and hot to hold on to. Silas came back out after putting Pearl to bed, and Clara was still on the porch, because she had needed a moment in the cool air before she went inside and became ordinary again. He came and stood beside her, not close, just present, and they both looked out at the dark land for a while. "You didn't have to stand up in there," he said. "I know. You could have let me and Catherine and the Reverend handle it." "I could have," Clara agreed. "But it was my name he was using. It seemed right that I should be the one to answer for it." She paused. "My father used to say that the only way a woman keeps her dignity in a room that wants to take it from her is to stand up and make them look at her directly. He said most people given the choice between looking someone in the eye and looking away will eventually look away." "Was he right?" "Hart left early," she said. Silas made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, and she felt it do something to the air between them. He shifted slightly. The space between them was the same as it had been, and also different. "Clara." His voice was careful, the voice of a man moving through territory he doesn't know well, but intends to navigate honestly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth without worrying about what I want to hear." "All right. Are you happy here?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those steady gray eyes, and she thought about all the things that question contained: the work, and the early mornings, and the weight of 3 grieving children, and the uncertainty and the town that had been ready to judge her, and the man standing beside her, who had chosen again and again, and without hesitation, to stand on her side of every line. "Yes," she said. "I'm happy here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He looked back out at the dark. Then quietly, carefully, "I want you to keep being happy here. I want—" He stopped. Tried again. "This family has needed you in ways I couldn't have described before you came, and now that you're here, I can't remember what it felt like to manage without you, and I don't want to." He stopped again. His jaw worked. He was not a man to whom words came easily, and she could see what this was costing him: the effort of saying the real thing instead of the safe approximation of it. "I know this arrangement started as one thing. I know you came here because you had no other choice, and I offered you work because I needed help, and that was the plain truth of it. But it isn't the plain truth anymore. Not for me." He looked at her. I want to know if it's still the plain truth for you." The porch was very quiet. Inside, she could hear Ruth Ann moving in the kitchen, the soft sound of the kettle, and somewhere upstairs, Pearl murmuring something in her sleep. Clara looked at Silas Whitfield. This man who had picked up her carpet bag on a stranger's platform and driven 7 miles home without once making her feel like a burden, who had stood between her and Douglas Hart's cruelty. Not with raised fists, but with the steady, immovable force of basic human decency, who had told a room full of people that she had his full confidence in a voice that left no room for argument. "No," she said. "It isn't the plain truth anymore. Not for me either," he breathed. Just once, like something in him had been waiting for permission to do it. "Then I'd like to ask you something," he said, "and I'd like you to take your time answering because it's not a small question and I'm not asking it lightly." "Ask it," she said. He turned to face her fully then, and he took her hands in his, the way he would pick up something he intended to be careful with. And he looked at her in the dark with those eyes that had seen enough hard weather to know the difference between a thing that would last and a thing that wouldn't. And he said, "Clara May Hutchins, I would like you to stay, not as my housekeeper, as my wife, as these children's mother, as the person whose place in this house is permanent and belonging and nobody's to dispute, not Douglas Hart's, not this town's nobody's." He paused. "I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't simple, and I know we've known each other 6 weeks, and I know there are people who will have something to say about it. I don't care about any of that. I care about whether you want to be here." Clara looked at him. She thought about the woman on the platform. She thought about Pearl's hand finding hers. She thought about Ruth Ann's voice in the dark. "I'm glad you didn't take the train." She thought about a life built not on romantic fantasy, but on the solid, daily, honest reality of people choosing each other in full knowledge of who they were. "Yes," she said. "I want to be here." His hands tightened on hers. Behind them, through the kitchen window, Ruth Ann had gone still. Whether she had heard Clara didn't know. But when they came inside a few minutes later, Ruth Ann was at the table with 3 cups of tea poured and her face arranged in its usual composure, and she looked up, and she looked at her father's face, and Clara's face, and she looked at their joined hands, and something in her expression shifted and settled the way a thing settles when it has found the place it was always meant to go. "Tea's ready," Ruth Ann said. And because there was nothing else to be said just then that would have been equal to what had just happened, they sat down together and drank it. They were married on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later in the yard of the Whitfield Ranch, because Silas had asked Clara where she wanted to do it, and she had said outside, and when he'd asked why, she'd said, "Because the last important thing that happened to me in a public building went badly, and she wanted this one to happen somewhere that was already hers." He hadn't argued. The Reverend Marsh came out from town. Henry and Catherine Alderman came, and the Johnsons, and 2 other families Clara had met only briefly, but who had stood up at the town meeting, and whose presence here felt like a continuation of that standing. It was not a large gathering. It was the right size. Ruth Ann had pressed Clara's good dress the night before, without being asked, working at it with the flat iron, with the focused care of someone doing something that mattered. She had not said much while she did it. But when she'd hung it on the peg in Clara's room, and Clara had thanked her, Ruth Ann had paused in the doorway and said very quietly, "Mama's garden is going to have tomatoes by next week. I thought you should know." And then she'd gone to bed, and Clara had stood in her room for a long moment, understanding that this was Ruth Ann's way of saying, "You belong to this place now, and this place belongs to you." Benjamin had polished Silas's good boots the morning of the wedding and left them outside his father's door without comment. This was so entirely in keeping with who Benjamin was that Silas had picked up the boots and held them for a moment before putting them on, and Clara, who had seen this from the hallway, had looked away to give him that moment in private. Pearl had appointed herself the official keeper of the wedding flowers, which consisted of whatever she could find blooming in the yard and the field beyond the fence, assembled into a bundle of cheerful and not entirely harmonious color that she presented to Clara with enormous solemnity immediately after breakfast. "I picked everyone myself," Pearl said. Even the ones that had bugs on them. I shook the bugs off. They're beautiful, Clara said, and meant it. You're supposed to hold them during the wedding, Pearl instructed. I looked at a picture of a wedding in Ruth Ann's book, and the lady held flowers. So you should hold them. I will hold them the entire time, Clara promised. Pearl nodded satisfied and went to find her father to inspect his appearance, because she had also decided she was in charge of that. The ceremony itself was brief and plain and honest, which was the only kind Clara had ever wanted. The Reverend Marsh spoke about partnership and faithfulness and the courage it took to build something real from the ground up. He did not speak about romance or fairy tales. He spoke about showing up day after day and choosing the person beside you with full knowledge of who they were and what that choice would cost, and being willing to pay it anyway. Silas held her hands through the whole of it. His rough, work-worn hands around hers, steady and warm, and he looked at her the way he looked at things he intended to keep. When it came to his vows, he said them without looking away from her face, in the same quiet, direct voice he used for things that were settled and not under discussion. I take you, Clara May, to be my wife, he said. I promise to stand beside you and in front of you and behind you whatever the occasion calls for. I promise to see you clearly and speak to you honestly and never make you feel small in my house or anywhere else. I promise to be a man you can count on. He paused. That's what I've got. It's not fancy, but I mean all of it. Clara said her vows with the same plainness. She promised to work beside him and care for his household and love his children as her own. And she promised to be someone he could count on too, and she promised to stay. Which was the one that cost her the most to say out loud, because staying had never been something anyone had wanted from her before, and the weight of being wanted for it was something she was still learning to carry without flinching. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Silas kissed her, Pearl cheered so loudly that General startled in the corral, and Benjamin said "Pearl" in the exact tone his father used, and Ruth Ann laughed a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a girl who had forgotten for a moment to be careful. Clara heard it and held it somewhere inside her chest like something precious. Catherine Alderman had brought food because Catherine Alderman understood that ceremonies required feeding, and the gathering moved to the table set up in the yard, and there was eating and talking, and the ordinary human warmth of people celebrating something good in a world that didn't always produce enough of it. Pearl installed herself in Clara's lap for most of it, and fell asleep there before the afternoon was half done, her head a trusting weight against Clara's shoulder, one hand still loosely holding the stem of a wildflower. Henry leaned over at one point and said, "Douglas Hart's feed contract came up for renewal this week." Silas looked at him. "And?" "He renewed it with the McKinley operation over in the next county." Henry's expression was carefully neutral. "Seems he decided to take his business elsewhere." "That's his right," Silas said. "It is. It's also the natural consequence of a man who called a town meeting to remove a woman from a household and found himself outvoted by his own neighbors." Henry picked up his coffee cup. "I'm not sorry about it." "Neither am I," said Catherine from 3 seats down without looking up. After the guests had gone and the children had drifted inside in the late afternoon full of food and worn by the day's festivities, Silas and Clara sat together on the porch steps in the cooling air. And it was quiet the way the end of a large thing is quiet. Not empty, just settled. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something that was broken for a long time just finished healing," she said. "A little tender still, but whole." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something I should have said before today." "All right. When I came to town that day, the day you arrived, I wasn't planning to help anyone. I had come in for grain and I was going home. I saw the crowd on the platform, and I saw Hart walking away from you, and I kept walking for about 30 seconds. He looked at his hands. And then I stopped. And I stood there for a moment thinking about all the reasons I should mind my own business. I had enough trouble. I had 3 children and a ranch running short-handed, and I didn't have room for someone else's problem." Clara watched the side of his face. "And then I looked back," he said, "and you were standing there with that bag and that photograph, and you weren't crying, and you weren't begging anyone for anything, And you were talking back to Geraldine Potts of all people about being treated like returned merchandise. Something moved across his face. And I thought there is a woman who is going to stand there alone with her dignity intact until the sun goes down if nobody does anything. And I didn't want to be someone who watched that happen. I'm glad you weren't, Clara said. What I'm trying to tell you, he said, is that it wasn't all charity. Some of it was, I saw something, in you, something I hadn't seen in a long time. What? He looked at her. Someone willing to fight for themselves when there was nothing left to fight with. He paused. My wife was like that. My first wife. It's a rare thing. I recognized it because I'd seen it before and I missed it. Clara looked at him for a long time. Thank you for telling me that. You deserve to know. He took her hand and they sat together on the steps of their house while the evening came on around them. The weeks that followed had their own shape different from the weeks before the wedding, though the work was the same. The difference was not in what they did, but in how the house held it the way a thing feels different once it has been named, once it is permanent and acknowledged and no longer held at arm's length. Clara had always worked hard in this house. Now she worked hard in her house, and the distinction was one she felt all the way down to her bones. Ruth Ann was the one who surprised her most in the end. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the wedding. Clara was in the garden on her knees in the rich turned soil, doing the work she'd been doing since her first week on the ranch, and Ruth Ann came out and crouched beside her without preamble, the way she had that first time, and for a while, they worked together in the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the months. Then Ruth Ann said, I want to learn to cook properly. Clara kept her hands in the soil. You cook fine. I cook adequately, Ruth Ann said in the precise tone of someone who has thought carefully about the distinction. I know enough to keep people from starving. I don't know enough to make something good, like you do. She paused. I want to know how to do that. I want to know the real way. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at her. Why? Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because Mama knew. And I never got to learn from her, and I've been angry about that for 2 years, and I've been angry at everyone who might have been able to show me because it felt like learning from someone else meant I was giving up on the idea that she would have been here to teach me herself. She stopped. Her hands were still in the soil. But she's not going to be here to teach me herself. And I don't want to be 40 and still not knowing how to make a proper pie crust because I was too angry to let anyone show me. Clara looked at her stepdaughter, and the word landed in her chest quietly. Stepdaughter. This fierce and tender and infuriating and magnificent girl, and she thought about everything it had cost Ruth Ann to say that out loud. Your mama's recipe book, Clara said. Is it still in the kitchen? Ruth Ann looked up. You knew about it. You put it back in the same place every time you take it out to look at it. Second shelf behind the baking powder. Clara met her eyes. We could start with whatever's on the first page. Ruth Ann breathed. It's apple cake. She made it every fall when the apples came in. The trees behind the barn are going to be ready in another few weeks, Clara said. We could be ready when they are. Something broke open in Ruth Ann's face. Then, not dramatically, not with tears or outpouring, but quietly, the way ice breaks in early spring, a crack and then a slow, irreversible opening. She pressed her lips together hard and nodded and looked back at the garden. Okay, she said. Yeah, okay. They finished the row in silence. When they went inside together, Ruth Ann went to the second shelf and took down the recipe book and set it on the kitchen table. And they looked at the first page together, at the handwriting that was not Clara's careful and precise, and belonging entirely to a woman Clara had never met, and would spend the rest of her life learning about in pieces. She wrote little notes in the margins, Ruth Ann said. She pointed to a small annotation beside the apple cake recipe. This one says double the cinnamon if you want Silas to eat it without complaining. Clara laughed. A real laugh surprised out of her, and Ruth Ann laughed too, and for a moment in the kitchen with the recipe book between them, they were just two women laughing about a man who had opinions about cinnamon. The final test came in November on a gray morning when Douglas Hart appeared at the ranch for the last time. He came alone, which Clara thought was either brave or foolish, and he tied his horse at the fence post and came to the door with his hat in his hands. And it was Clara who answered it because Silas was in the far pasture and the children were inside, and she was the one who went to the door. He looked older. He looked like a man who had spent several months sitting with the consequences of his own behavior and finding the experience educational, if not particularly comfortable. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. She waited. "I came to—" He stopped. He seemed to be finding it difficult to locate the words he'd brought with him. "What I did on that platform, the way I spoke to you, it was wrong." Clara looked at him steadily. She thought about the woman she'd been on that platform, standing with her carpet bag and her torn future, holding herself together through sheer will, while this man's laughter was still fresh in the air. She thought about what that woman would have wanted to hear. "Yes," she said. "It was. I had no right to speak to you that way, to any woman that way." He looked at his hat. "I've had some time to think about it. It sounds like you have. I'm not asking for. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it, that it was wrong." He looked up at her. "You deserved better than what I gave you." Clara considered him for a long moment. She thought about grace, about what it cost and what it built, and whether it was a thing you gave because you owed it, or because of who you wanted to be. "I did deserve better," she said, "and I got it. So I suppose things worked out." She paused. "I won't tell you that what you did didn't hurt because it did, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But I also won't carry it anymore. It's too heavy, and there's too much else to carry that's worth the weight." He nodded. He looked, she thought, genuinely diminished, and not in a way she found satisfying. Just diminished the way people looked when they finally understood the size of the thing they'd done. "I heard about the wedding," he said, "and that the children are doing well." "They are. I'm glad." He said it quietly, and she believed him. He put his hat back on and gathered his reins and looked at her one more time. "I hope you'll be happy here, Mrs. Whitfield." "I already am," she said. He rode away. She stood on the porch and watched him go and felt nothing move in her chest when he went. No anger, no satisfaction, no residue of that old pain. It had been true what she'd told him. She had put it down, and the ground where she'd set it had already grown over. Silas came in from the pasture an hour later, and she told him what had happened, and he listened without expression until she was done. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine." She looked at him. "He apologized. I think he meant it. Do you forgive him?" She thought about it. "I think I've been forgiving him a little at a time since the day I walked off that platform," she said. "Today was probably the last of it." Silas nodded slowly. He pulled her close, his arms around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who had learned that being held was something she was allowed to want. "It's over then," he said. "It's over," she agreed. That evening, all five of them sat at the table for supper, Silas at the head, Clara across from him. Benjamin with his practical efficiency, Pearl with her endless commentary, Ruth Ann with her careful dignity that was slowly, incrementally, beautifully learning to relax, and the food was good, and the talk was ordinary, and the lamplight was warm, and Clara looked around at these people who were her people now, at this house, that was her house now, at this life that she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not have traded for anything in the world. She thought about a woman on a train platform in the summer, standing in the wreckage of one future, about to walk into another without knowing it. She thought about how that woman had believed for one terrible suspended moment that being rejected meant being worth nothing. She knew now that she had been wrong, not because Silas Whitfield had chosen her, though he had, but because she had stood on that platform with every reason to fall apart, and had not fallen apart, and that had been entirely her own. The rejection had not made her. She had made herself the same way she had made this garden and this kitchen and this family, through daily, unglamorous, honest work, through showing up when it was hard, and staying when it was easier to go through, choosing to be worth something when the world was suggesting otherwise. Pearl tugged on her sleeve. "Clara, Benjamin took the last biscuit, and he knows I wanted it. I was faster, Benjamin said without guilt. That's not fair. Life isn't... Benjamin, Silas said. Benjamin handed Pearl the biscuit without further comment. Pearl received it with queenly satisfaction. Ruth Ann pressed her lips together against a smile. Clara May Hutchins Whitfield looked at her family across the supper table in the warm and ordinary light of a November evening in Wyoming, and understood with the full weight of a woman who had earned the right to understand it that home was not the place you arrived at. It was the place you built, day by day, choice by choice, meal by meal, until one evening you looked up and realized you were no longer building it. You were living in it. And the difference between those two things was the whole of what mattered. She was living in it now, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.